go get a pencil, go get a sheet of paper or a notebook, sit down, we're gonna make this a pub draw, draw with me. If you're feeling especially daring, try not to copy exactly what I do, try to just make your own thing. Alright, hello humans! My name is Dael Kingsmill. I'm getting a lot of questions about drawing maps, which is a little odd because I'm not the map drawing D&D person, that's WASD20, or Questing Beast if you're looking for cities. Check them both out, super dope. But I suppose I do have some tips. I do draw my own maps, and I guess I might be like that more approachable ground of like, my maps look pretty good, but also I'm not like a cartographer, an artiste. So I don't know, if people are interested, I'm gonna show you how I do a map. A continental map. We might do another one on city maps. This one doesn't have any crass acronyms for you to use, I'm very sorry. So, first thing, I like to draw my maps on lined paper to begin with, in pencil, because that communicates to my brain that, you know, it's no big deal, we're just drafting something. Where's my pencil gone? Oh, I was sitting on it. This says, do your best, or don't, whatever. And that's the attitude I want you to take into this with me. This is my high-tech setup that I have going. I'm gonna point this generally in the direction of the paper, and we're gonna hope for the best. Got all my important equipment. I have a pencil, I have an eraser shaped like a lemon, and I have a pencil sharpener shaped like R2-D2. You've probably already heard of this method, but I mean, it's worth mentioning if you haven't. You get your bag of dice and you pour them onto the page like so, and then you trace around them and you make a map out of what they've done. Then you, oh, I'm not even pointing at the right thing. Oh, this is a nightmare. Then you trace around it and it gives you an uneven coastline, which is a thing that people seem to struggle with. Alright, and here's one of those that I prepared earlier. Is this even working? See, there you go. There's my dice prepped map. I think it's a good system for making islands. I don't know, a lot of people swear by it. I don't tend to use it, but it's worth hearing about if you haven't heard about it. It's not as dramatic as I'm about to make it sound, but it's just, the tips I'm going to be giving you throughout this are things that are so obvious once someone points them out. And it's stuff that you definitely already know, but you're not necessarily thinking of while you're drawing your map. There are a couple of things that are like the big rules that I think you need to know about. And those basically come down to plate tectonics. Yes, we're getting into that stuff. And gravity. These are the two things you need to really remember while you're making a map. And once they're pointed out to you, you go, oh wait, yeah, that totally makes sense, right? So now, here we go. I'm going to just sort of rough a quick outline here and hope that I'm pointing the camera in the right direction. I'm gonna make a continent, just a half of a continent. I'm gonna make it pointing this direction, I think, because I think, we have a tendency in the early days of making maps to just make an island because it feels complete. That's perfectly legit, you can make yours an island. But for me, I love a good continent, and especially because a continent tends to lend itself to, if you need to change the location, if you need to go somewhere more exotic, a continent tends to be really good for that because it's not going to be tricky to travel necessarily, or you can make it as tricky as you want to travel. Plus, I think it's a good way to start to do just sort of a nation's worth of a map. And when I say a nation, I don't necessarily mean that this is all just one kingdom or whatever. But I am talking about, there's a documentary that I saw once that was about horses and their impact on human civilization. And the thing that stayed in my head with that was the idea that an empire could only be as large as it took 2 weeks to travel. So when people weren't domesticating horses, or there weren't horses in certain locations, humans could only have pretty small kingdoms because they could only travel by foot, and you can't travel as far by foot, so the kingdoms were only, you know, so big. But then once we got horses, the kingdoms got bigger. Once we got naval developments, the kingdoms got bigger, or empires, or what have you. And the idea was that you could only effectively sustain an empire of that size because you would need to get a message to the capital that there was, you know, strife on the border or what have you, things like that. So you had to be able to get messages to and fro pretty quickly. And then, of course, they can be broken down after that. They can be old kingdoms that are no more. Oh no, now my hair's getting in the way. Okay, so if I can get this to focus up a little bit. Some pro tips for people who don't draw very often. These are more things that are going to seem obvious, but when I watch people draw who don't draw very often, I tend to notice two things. Either they press quite hard with the pencil, which is a problem because then if they go to erase anything, it's like embedded into the page. There's an indent in the page. Or I see people sketching, and there's kind of a tendency, we all do it when we're first sort of enamored with the idea of sketching. We do this thing where we draw lots of tiny little lines over and over, and we think that that's what sketching is. That's not sketching. What you want to do with sketching is sort of trust your hand and just make big arcs and let it be loose and let it be messy, and then you just draw over it once you've kind of figured out what you're going with. You don't want any lines to be particularly solid or straight or anything like that. That's not how coastlines tend to work. So, I don't know. Alright, there we go. That's a coastline. Oh my gosh, I'm terrible at pointing this. Oh, I'm so sorry. So that's step one, draw a messy coastline. Make sure that it kind of ins and outs. If you're struggling with it, pour a bunch of dice on the page and just sort of trace around them. The next thing is mountains. Here's where the plate tectonics come in. Because if you look at a lot of mountain ranges and the outlines of tectonic plates, you will see that a lot of coastlines are formed by the edges of tectonic plates. It's where we all know the thing, the tectonic plates come together and they push together, or one goes underneath the other, and you end up with volcanoes, you end up with mountain ranges. That's how we get these things. So a lot of the time when you're putting a mountain range in your map on your continent, you're going to probably want it to be coastal. This isn't a hard and fast rule. They don't all have to be coastal, but a good element of what makes a coastline is often mountainous terrain, even if it isn't a mountain by the time you add in water and gravity. You're gonna sort of want a mountain range happening. I think this looks like a good line. See how this comes in here? Because we have, where's my camera? Because we have this sort of bay happening, and then this comes in the other direction and then sticks out here, that is a particularly good line for a mountain range to take to be the edge of a tectonic plate. You see that? By the way, I'm not saying that you need to work out all the tectonic plates of your world. It's just good to be informed by that information. Trust me, when I was younger, I tried to like design the tectonic plates first and then build the continents out of that, and it just doesn't work unless you are a geologist, I assume. So of course, if you're looking at this, you could have put yours elsewhere. Here's another good line you could have taken with it. You've got this sticky outy bit. That wouldn't have been a bad one at all. You could have an island chain coming off here. Actually, that would be pretty neat. Do I want to do that instead? I might want to do that instead, guys. I kind of like that line. I'm gonna put a little mountain. I'm gonna put a little island chain coming off here because, actually, worth noting, that's what a lot of island chains are, and why a lot of island chains are volcanic. It's because those are mountains, or the equivalent of mountain ranges. They just happen to be under the water. Does that make sense? I'm just pointing it totally in the wrong direction. I'm so sorry. Yeah, that's kind of cool. Yeah. So if you look at, for example, between Russia and Alaska, there's a really specific line taken in the island chain that runs between those two, and that's because that's the top of the Pacific tectonic plate. That's the line that it follows, and so there's a chain of islands that are just the tops of what would be mountains if there wasn't water. Same with Indonesia, that's the edge of tectonic plate. New Zealand is entirely mountains that come from the edge of tectonic plate. So that's where we get a lot of those. Kind of like that. I wish it was a little bit more uneven. So this is what we're doing with this. You just sort of trial and error-ing. Don't feel afraid to change stuff after you've done it. Ugh. Because I feel like that looked a little too even for my liking. I'm a big fan of asymmetry. What if we make this one a little bit more of a hook-shaped? Does that look cool? Yeah, maybe stick a couple of these islands out here, and then we can have a bit of a break before we get more islands. How about that? Yes, that's pretty cool. I like that. Yeah, that's not bad. I wish a little bit that it was further from the coast, so I'm actually going to move the coastline in. So let's see. I want that same shape basically, but see how I'm trying to weight it down this direction a little bit, just to provide a little bit more asymmetry. I'm going to take away this lump. See what I've done here? See how I've pressed a little too hard and then you end up with these dark lines? It's because I was super confident and I liked it a lot. And I was like, yes, lock it in, Eddie. And then now I'm erasing it and it's a little bit more problematic. See, I like that. I like that. That's cool. That's a cool little string of islands. We've got some interest to our coastline. Check it out. We're doing mountains. Here we go. WASD 20 has the coolest tips on drawing mountains for your map, like in terms of what the key is for them. I just do little peaky peaks. It'd be cool if this mountain range gets a bit broader down here, and then they can sort of fade off into more hill country up the top. All right, cool. We've got some mountains happening over there. Do I want more mountains? I might make this coast over here mountainous too. I was considering it and then I was unconsidering it, but I think I'm back to liking it again. Okay, now this is a big fat continent. We should probably have some water happening inland, whether it's an inland sea, whether it's a lake, things like that. Let's stick a cool lake in here somewhere. How about we do that? Now, what's going on with lakes is similar thing to when we're doing the coastline. You just want it to be sort of uneven, doing its whatevers. So with a lake where you get these extra pointed bits, that tends to be where a river connects to the lake and feeds into it. 2 seconds, I need my both hands to erase this momentarily. I didn't quite like the look of that. I didn't unlike the look of that, but it's ending up a little bit more, again, even than I necessarily want it to. Maybe it's just because I need this one to point the other direction. That could be it. There we go. That's more like it. That's more like it. Because the dealio with lakes and rivers is, and this is going to be really obvious the minute I say it, but some of you may not realize, water obeys gravity. I think the big trick when we're making up maps just from our head for the sake of fantasy is that we tend to look at rivers. We sort of think of them as like they come from the sea and then they branch out like veins into the wilderness or whatever, you know? We think of them like we use words that describe them like trees branching out, or we think of them like veins that we see in ourselves. And it makes sense, but the language of it means that we think of them as coming from the sea inland and spreading out, rather than the truth, which is that water tends to start in mountainous areas, high altitude areas where it has rained, and then they travel downhill, and water tends to flow downhill. It tends to flow together and it flows towards the sea, which is something we all know, but when we're drawing maps, it's not the thing that we're thinking about, you know? So like we tend to see, you know, people will draw a map and then they'll go, and then the river from here and it goes all down into this place and goes to the lake, blah, blah, blah. That's not how it would work. So what should be happening is the mountains here would probably be leading rivers directly into the water at these inlets. Now, having a lake out here means that this is part of a big old basin because the water has to travel downhill. But that makes sense because we've got this big old ring of mountains sort of around the coast. So the water that gets to the other side of these mountains is unlikely to, you know, climb up the mountain to get over to go straight to the sea. No, it's going to go the other direction where the ground is lower because the tectonic plates have pushed upwards. You see how it all kind of fits together? So the water from here is going to drain down from these mountains. Let's see if I can remember to use the freaking camera. It's gonna travel down. It's gonna end up in here. Dum-ba-dow. See how it flows together and it flows into the lake. This branch of the river, gonna be a similar thing. Let's say that it hits some tricky ground, so it kind of, it detours itself. Keep in mind when you're doing this that rivers will take the path of least resistance around stuff, but they do kind of morph the geography around them, so they will end up windy. That means that this is probably also mountainous if we've got the river coming from here. So let's do that. Bow. Cool, nice, great. We got some major rivers happening, and then they probably empty to the south. That makes sense, doesn't it? See how messy this map is? Like, you don't gotta worry about it looking neat. Don't worry about it looking neat. This here probably means that there are more mountains northward. Maybe it's just talking about the high altitude of the hills that we got from this mountain range as it sort of petered out. So, you know, this river maybe has an easier time coming up there. Or maybe you don't want that river. I feel like we've got a lot of rivers happening, so I'm gonna actually get rid of this. Dramatic change. And what we do there, because we can't sort of leave it pointy because that indicates that there's a river emptying in, what we can do is give it sort of a different little lumpity bumpity. That can be sort of a rough edge. And keep in mind the distance of this map. So this is a pretty huge area. So that lake is massive. Already, those two things to keep in mind give you so much sort of reality to your map in terms of you've got your mountains, they're formed by plate tectonics. That often forms the coastline of a country because, again, water follows gravity. It just comes together. That's what coastlines are. The combination of water following gravity. It eventually leads to the ocean, right? Because that's down. And coastlines are often formed with the edges of tectonic plates because that's pushing the ground up above the waterline. So this is the kind of thing that you can start to end up with. But that doesn't give you everything that you might want on a map. So how do these things affect the rest of the kind of terrains that you're gonna end up with? Let's briefly touch on that, shall we? So for starters, we got coasts. Coasts are all gonna be pretty, you know, straightforward. But you might just want to sketch in your beaches here. You want sandy beaches? They're probably going to form in bays like this. And you just kind of do a smoother connection between whatever has happened in your rough coastlines. Because the rough coastlines are kind of where the rocks and stuff are. Maybe we make that stretch out. Does that stretch out? Does that stretch out into a bigger beach? That could be cool. This is going to be a neat little bay here. We got more over here. That could be cool. Have a little like rocky mountainous edge, but down here there's a nice little sandy alcove. Cool. Up here, this one's gonna be actually this one's gonna be tricky because it's between so many mountainous regions. I probably wouldn't make that one particularly sandy. Make it more craggy, cliffy kind of stuff. You might want a desert. I'm gonna go ahead and suggest that you don't just plunk the desert down anywhere. Plunking a desert down tends to make it look unnatural, which is what we're trying to avoid here. So, what causes a desert? Well, some fun facts about deserts for you. I have learned that apparently deserts tend to be on the western sides of continents. Something to do with air currents. I don't fully understand. You can follow that if you would like to. Go, oh, I'll put the desert in the west then, because it'll like ping in people's brains as realistic. That's a fair call. But also, it's a fantasy map, and you don't have to if you don't want to. I just thought it would be fun for you to know. What else causes deserts? I will tell you. The two biggest ones that I think are useful for making a fantasy map are what's called a rain shadow. This is where you get sections of mountain. This isn't the best map for it because we've, you know, organized it a bit differently. But for example, if we ignore all this river business, basically a rain shadow is caused when, you know how we get rain on coastlines because sort of the heavy water-laden clouds and air come in and they sort of try to move up the mountain, and as they try to move up the mountain, they drop all their rain and all the rain goes on that side of the mountain and flows down between the mountain and the sea. We've all seen those diagrams when we were in 3rd grade, right? So what happens is all those water-laden clouds get to the mountain range and they've dropped all of their water before they get to the other side of the mountain. So maybe the mountains are too tall, maybe the air is fairly dry so it doesn't have that much rain to give up. But basically what it leads to is that one side of the mountain range gets all of the rainfall and it gets lush, growing forests and whatever, and the other side of the mountain is left with nothing but dry air, and you end up with deserts on one side of a mountain range while the other side is all lush and lovely. The other kind is when you do get rainfall on the mountains and it's coming in different directions, or in high altitude snow on the mountains, which melts and becomes rivers during the springtime, and those rivers end up feeding all of the land away from the mountains, right? So this would be fairly sort of thriving ground because there would be quite a lot of water coming from these mountains. But the tricky thing is that at a certain point after lots of flat ground, you're gonna run out of water. So for example, the Rockies, water from snowfall on the Rockies in the United States, that snow ends up being most of the water that goes to Nevada and Utah and New Mexico and even California. And basically, Utah gets tons of the water, but then by the time it gets to Nevada, and by the time it gets to New Mexico, there's less water, and by the time it gets to California, there's even less, and so that can contribute to very arid regions. So you can already see how you would place a desert. If you were drawing a bigger map down around here, you could put desert all up in this space that we haven't got because, you know, the water's all traveling away from it, so you end up with an arid region up here. I don't think I will be putting a desert on this map, personally. Don't feel like you have to include every type of dramatic terrain on your map. That becomes super cluttered and gets hard to sort of comprehend entirely. And again, it doesn't look as realistic. What I am going to put up here is grassland. Grasslands can be a brilliant stepping stone between regions to make the terrain seem to naturally flow. So if you were to go from mountain to grassland to desert, that would be following that thing like I was just talking about with the Rockies feeding into Nevada, right? You would have grassland for Utah, followed by Nevada desert, swampland. Now, here's how swampland works. As far as fantasy is concerned, swamps basically come in two kinds. You have your swamps, the kind with trees, and you have your marshes, the kind with like grass mostly. The Devil's Bayou, the dead marshes. You get what I'm saying? Now, wetlands happen when there's a lot of water coming in to an environment, but there's not really an adequate drainage method for getting the water out. Again, sounds super obvious, but you're not necessarily thinking about it when you're plonking a swamp onto your map. Swamps, the kinds with trees, more likely to happen sort of growing around rivers, so they will often happen because there's tons of rainfall or lots and lots of water coming in around a river, so the river is overflowing and you end up with kind of like a main current, but then the rest of it is also covered in water. Versus a marsh is more likely to happen around sort of lakey areas. It tends to be flatter terrain, so there's no clear path for the water to take out. If, for example, there was a source of water continuously pouring into a prairie, that prairie would become a marsh because it's just tons of land with no specific, gravity can't do its thing. It can't form the river because it's all just flat. So now remember that this is water coming from these mountains down this direction. It would be very possible for this area here to become swampy swampland. See that? You could suggest that there was just tons of rainfall in this area, and this is the main line that the river takes, but all of this space around it could easily become just overgrown with overflowing edges to rivers, billabongs, that sort of a thing, to the point where it just becomes one big bayou. Up here, where we've put grasslands, alternatively, you could turn this into a marsh instead of grassland. You could say that there's heaps of water coming in here from the mountains, but that this is all super flat country that can't like get rid of it really easily and make all of this marshy up here. Again, you can see how grassland becomes the middle point between a marsh and, you know, you go marsh, grassland, then there's forest and human settlements. Arctic, put Arctic regions where you want it to be cold. quite frankly. There's a lot of fancy stuff that you can get into in terms of like, do you want it to be cold in the north or the south or even the east? Where are your poles? So if you want to play around with that, go for broke, have fun, just make it cold where you want it to be cold. Remember that high altitudes tend to get more snow, so the mountains are probably going to be snowier if they're mountains. For me personally, I like to stick to cold in the north because of the shorthand that it provides. Because fantasy is, I mean, basically born of Tolkien, right? We have this sort of medieval Europe analog going on with most fantasy settings, and as a result, we associate north with cold in fantasy. And while that is absolutely not an essential point of any fantasy world, I think it is handy to have those shorthands because it means that your players can just assume. They will look at this map and they will go like, oh yeah, it's snowy in the north, that makes sense. Even here in Australia, where the north is tropical rainforests and you're gonna die from the heat Queensland, we still look at a fantasy map and we kind of assume to see cold north. And forests are super freaking easy because back in the day, we had forests sort of everywhere. Trees are real good at growing, you guys, so I would go so far as, like, the forests are gonna grow around the rivers that you've got, you know, they're gonna grow around the lake. I would go so far as to probably make most of this forested. Plus forests, the other thing with them is that they grow on other stuff. So they grow in a swamp and they grow on mountains and things like that. So, you know, it's not something to stress yourself out about too much. Might make this one huge forested region sort of growing up to the edges of this lake. That would be cool. Ooh, forest, forest, forest. Again, just sort of squiggles to indicate that there are leaves here. They're just slightly more rounded than the mountains were. Make sure that you get them in different sizes though, because otherwise it starts to look like, I don't know, not good. There's one huge forest. I'm gonna put another forest here that will be slightly smaller. Neat. Chunks of forest here and there, all over the place. And this is where it gets to be more, you know, swampy here. Down. So this is more foresty, that's more swampy. And the borderline between them is kind of blurry, you don't know. I think to indicate the difference between a swamp and a forest, you just make the lines a little bit more tangled, make them longer, make them, yeah, see that? And then up here you get more forest again, hooray! Forested trees on the mountains. Ta-da! Maybe some coastal forest down here. Cool. Great. You know what, we could say that this gets to be sort of savanna, getting a little bit more arid here in between. Because all the water here is getting sucked into this flat swamp area, right? And all the water from the lake is draining out around the edges here. So this would be much more grassy, and then this would get sort of a little bit drier and drier and drier as it gets further away from sort of that space. Touch on human settlements and where we tend to set up shop. This is of course only speaking of permanent settlements. Let's put an island there. I like it. Let's give it an island. Maybe another tiny little one here. Yeah, good. I would simplify it to probably humans set up towns where there are resources that they can use for survival, cities where they can set up major places of trade easily, fortresses where things are super defensible, and major like hubs of civilization where you get combinations of those, where you can enable trade and there are resources and you can defend it really easily. Those are where like the big capital places end up, right? Human roads, water follows gravity and takes the path of least resistance. Humans take the laziest path. They will take straight lines where they can, but they would rather go downhill or stay on flat ground rather than take a straight line over a hill, you know what I mean? So often human roads will follow rivers. Now if you wanted to divide up into kingdoms, you would divide along river lines, mountain lines. Those are the major things that divide nations because they form natural borders. They're more easily defensible in terms of a war, and you can sort of hold the line in those places. That's how I drew a map. After this, just to show you very briefly, because everyone asks what program I use. There are tons of great programs that people have mentioned to me in the past. Everyone constantly recommends Incarnate. Everyone has seen Matt Colville do his hexographer maps. Those are great programs, but when people ask me what I use a pencil and paper, and then I use Photoshop. I'm sorry, but it's the truth, but I'm gonna show you what you can do if you want to do it this way. Color it all in, you've got your sketch underneath, you end up with something looking like this, and people are like, ooh la la, that's so fancy. What program did you use? And you say, I didn't. I used my hands and a pencil. Hopefully you found some of that useful. Hit me up on Twitter, show me the maps that you drew if you drew maps with me. I want to see what you got. Did you include a desert? Is it in a rain shadow? Let me know. This is gonna be hell to edit. Apart from that, I do believe that's it. I'm done. Email this to your grandma and I will see you some other time. I'm hiding. You can't see me. I'm gone. I'm not there anymore. Ow. This is why when you ask me to start a stream where I play D&D, I'm not lying when I say I don't have the setup.